I came across an article that kind of went viral. A lot of conversation sparked a lot of conversation online, and it was in the publication The Atlantic, and it was titled "The Elite College Students Who Can't Read Books." And it kind of goes into some data, some interviews of this sort of trend of just like, even like the elite, Ivy League colleges and stuff. People just like either just don't read books or like almost can't read books, don't have the attention to read books. So some of the stuff, the data that stood out to me, and then we can get into this, says, going before the colleges, the 3rd to 8th grade, when they were surveyed, classes, teachers, only 17% teachers were surveyed that they teach like whole texts. Like, we're going to go over, Huckleberry Finn, and we're going to read Huckleberry Finn. Only 17% actually like read the whole book. Instead, it's become more, I think, reminiscent of like TikTok, Twitter, X, or whatever, of like very small excerpt. Like, we're going to read this couple pages, and then here's a summary, and like just kind of that more bite-size approach to these stories. And then kind of the article writer says, whether through atrophy or apathy, a generation of students is reading fewer books. They might read more as they age. Older adults are the most vocacious readers, but the data is not encouraging. The American Time Use Survey shows that the overall pool of people who read books for pleasure has shrunk over the past 2 decades. A couple of professors told me that their students see reading books akin to listening to vinyl records, something that a very small subculture may still enjoy, but that's mostly a relic of an earlier time. And then kind of one of the parts in the article that made it go viral, where the guy says, teacher says, over and over, the professor I spoke to spoke with a pained, grim picture of young people's reading habits. For years, Dames, who's a teacher, has asked his first years about their favorite book. In the past, they said to books such as Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre. Now, he says, almost half of them cite young adult books. Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series seems to be a particular favorite, and he goes on to sort of challenge why that's not a good thing, that we've replaced Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre with Percy Jackson. And it is sparked, because there's another article kind of in response to that from the publication The Mary Sue, titled, College Professor Sparks Fierce Debate Over Criticism of a Student Who Likes Percy Jackson. And here's where they sort of sum up the divide, and then we can get into that. They say, there does seem to be a shift in reading preferences and comprehension, but not all these shifts have to be a negative. These changes could reflect readers feeling more freedom to read for fun and more confident in establishing their own likes and interests instead of feeling the pressure to appear well-read to their peers. Ultimately, writing off students for not sharing one's sophisticated taste in literature sounds far more detrimental to students' reading performance than a first-year student liking Percy Jackson. So this is an interesting conversation. I mean, and there's aspects to it that we don't have time to go down all the different roads, but I think there is sort of the idea of just reading in general seems to be, like it's sad for that to be a vinyl record. I guess, there's like old-fashioned thing. I think that's an important part of this. I think the other part is this sort of that, there's always been sort of that constant divide between sort of like, like highbrow, low, like the sophisticated, the elite, I read Dickens, or I read, like the, Hemingway, and as opposed to, like, I read 50 Shades of Grey, or like, whatever, the Twilight books are my favorite books. Like, there's sort of that sort of tension of more like the popular sort of lower level literature as opposed to sort of the more established stuff. But what are some of your, because we're both book people.
Yeah. And I was not, like, growing up, I was not a big reader. And I think I've only, like, just later in life become, a better reader, but also, like, someone who just prioritizes reading more than what I did growing up. And so I totally can understand just sort of that idea of, like, I think it's probably better to read something than to read nothing. And so on the one hand, I think it is, hey, if Percy Jackson is the thing you're into, good for you, I guess. But on the other hand, I think if you're like a, 18-year-old, 19-year-old in college, it's, I think there's just some weird stuff with how some of it's worded. So it's like, okay, maybe Percy Jackson was what kind of got you into reading, and so that's considered your favorite book. But it would be interesting to maybe look further and to see, well, are they reading other books as well? Or is this like, because like your favorite book, that's a pretty subjective question. And I think and I do think there probably is a lot of people who would feel, at least in years past, like they need to say one of the classics to look like I'm cool and, you know, I'm not a total loser. And so it's like, well, I'll just, you know, say Mark Twain or something and appear sophisticated and
Was it
well
Mark Twain? I
read.
forget the exact quote. I think it was Mark Twain that like defined classic literature. So those are the books that like everyone has on their bookshelf, but
But no one read. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that, so, I mean, I think, you know, reading is better than not reading. And then I think if you can read more and maybe even more challenging books is, you know, better than to not, you know, to only read like the stuff that, you know, is just fun, I guess. But yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things that I think is, I can see kind of both sides of this, and I don't know. I just think it to me, the saddest thing is just that like so few people are reading and that teachers are only teaching like parts, which seems kind of absurd to me on a lot of levels, that like you wouldn't just, why not teach the whole story?
I mean, I have school age kids like in that range, and it's like they're at school a long time. Like,
Yeah.
I know they got to learn a lot of stuff, but like there's time to get through
Yeah.
And like my kids, their school, they do read full books. I mean, they're still shorter. They're not like, you know, War and Peace yet. Or
Sure. Well, I mean, like, because there's a lot of books that, like, I've tried to read some of the Russian classics, and like, even still, it's like, oh man, like some of this is like, it's just really dense. It's hard to get through, and you really have to be like committed, you know, to like finish, you know, the Brothers Karamazov or something like that. Whereas, like, you know, it's much easier to read, you know, other authors who are just, you know, it reads faster, it's more interesting, it's more of a page turner. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's valid things on both sides. Like I think on the one sense, you do have sort of that elitist mindset of like, you know, the only stories that matter are the ones that were written like 500 years ago.
Yeah.
Everything else since then is just, you know, like I think stories are stories. I think stories are powerful, and like, you know, I think the advantage that some of the older ones has is like they've been proven by time to be great, and we still read them because, you know, we still read Shakespeare, not just because he's Shakespeare, but because time has proven that he's timeless, and like his stories are great, and
Yeah.
you know, so I think it has that advantage. But I think I almost this like built-in assumption that like if it's sort of more popular level, or like, you know, like a Percy Jackson, like that there's no value, you don't get any value out of this. It's just junk food. I think it's just not true. I think there's value in kind of stories. I think on the other side, in some ways, it almost ties into what we just talked about with the movies. I feel like literature and books have almost gone through the same like progression of like, it's like just sort of funneled down to more like easily accessible, not challenging, kind of, you know, more floaty. Like it's, you know, it's like I know a lot of young, you know, the biggest readers of young adult literature are like grown adults. Like it's not young. Like it's sort of still stuck in some of the stuff that's written sort of, you know, not that there's anything wrong with ever reading those books, but like just not challenging you in the same way.
Yeah.
Or like not, you know, just not maybe quite as like rich as far as like, you know, thematically, or just, you know, I think there's value in reading a book that requires patience, and you got to really work through, as opposed to just like, you know, a brisk page turner with a cliffhanger every chapter. And like, you know, like those are great for the beach, but like I feel like we are losing something, and I feel like it's kind of recent too. Like, I don't think we've really seen what a culture looks like, you know, that's more getting that, you know, getting those stories and stuff from like social media or TikTok or whatever, or just streaming, as opposed to like a culture, you know, like reading has always been a thing, a foundational thing.
Yeah. What does an illiterate but informed culture look like? That, I mean, that'll be interesting. Like because I mean, even like literacy rates, I think, have kind of fallen off a cliff, too. And some of it, you know, we've been like, we have, our oldest is in kindergarten, and the whole like learn to read with phonics versus like sight words, which I didn't even know was a thing. And it's just basically like memorizing what words look like rather than like how they sound out and like what the letters actually do within a grouping. And so some of it even comes back to like early education, like teaching kids to actually read and and not just sort of shuffling them to the next grade and now it's somebody else's problem. And then I think you get to college and you're not able to focus on a book for a semester, or you can only do like a portion of it. And I think what I think college and university should be is that training ground to, okay, well, I don't understand this book, but we're going to go through it for a semester, and by the end of it, I will know how to approach a book like this that I may not otherwise read. Like there wasn't a lot of books that I was reading in like college English that I was like, can't wait to read this on my spare time. Like they were challenging because you're in school to learn. And so I think there's also just this, I think, responsibility of the university to challenge students with like whole text and text that maybe their students wouldn't read, at the beach, but it's still worth kind of working that muscle of reading and comprehension and critical thinking that it's hard to get outside of college.
Yeah, and I think just instilling a love for reading. And maybe that's what more a pro Percy Jackson thing of just like, I feel like the reason a lot of people don't read after like high school is because reading was just a painful thing they had to do.
Yeah.
And I feel like if you can get someone just to love reading, like I didn't start loving reading by reading the Russian classics. Like I was reading, like, pulpy fantasy novels, and like that led to I just love reading, and now I can read other stuff. And I do think this from a Christian perspective, we can maybe end there, but it's like God did give his special revelation about himself through like the written word.
Yeah.
He could have done that in the age of TikTok and YouTube, or like, there's other ways he could have maybe done that. And I think because you hear people talk about Christianity, Christians being like more people of the book. Obviously referring to like the Bible, but I feel like you can almost expand that, like not in the same degree of importance, but like just of like the word, like of language. Yeah. And I feel like there is sort of that. I think that God did that just affirms like there's power in words and in the written language. I think as as a culture, but especially as Christians, we should be not too quick to sort of move away from that as some like outdated relic, and we got videos, so we don't need that stuff because there's a lot of great wisdom in stories.